It started after a quiet London rain. The streets shimmered with puddles reflecting lamps, windows, and passing footsteps. But one puddle reflected nothing. No sky, no light, no movement, just a dark, perfect void that swallowed its surroundings. Most walked past it without a second glance. But when a man was found dead beside it, with no sign of struggle and no reflection in his eyes, the case was sent to Baker Street, and Sherlock Holmes instantly knew this was no ordinary puddle. It wasn't what it showed, it was what it refused to show that held the truth. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if mysteries like this make your mind race, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because every case here pulls you deeper into the world of Sherlock Holmes. Now, pick up your cup of tea, sit back, and get ready to lose yourself in tonight's mystery. Sherlock Holmes and the Puddle with No Reflection. Chapter 1. The Puddle with No Reflection. It was on a particularly dreary morning in late October that I found myself once more in our shared quarters at 221B Baker Street, watching the rain thrum with steady insistence against the soot-smudged windowpane. Holmes sat unmoving in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon the flickering embers in the hearth. For nearly an hour he had maintained this monk-like posture, the only signs of life being the occasional twitch of his brow or the murmured whisper of Latin under his breath. I had long since given up on engaging him in conversation and instead turned my attention to a copy of the Times, wherein the front page reported a string of burglaries in Lam. Yet before I could turn to the medical column, a sharp rap at the door interrupted our silence. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a calling card on a silver tray. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said with her usual tight-lipped efficiency. "Says it's most urgent." Holmes took the card, glanced at it, and passed it wordlessly to me. "Mr. Cyril Addison, Warden, Ravensby, School for Boys, East Sussex." "Show him up," Holmes said at last, stretching his limbs like a man waking from a long sleep. "And Watson, if you would be so kind as to observe our guest's footwear when he arrives. I believe you will find something of interest." Moments later, Mr. Cyril Addison entered, a tall, hollow-cheeked man with watery eyes and a mustache as stiff as the lines of his jacket. His demeanor was one of forced composure, the sort of brittle dignity cultivated by long years of institutional authority. "You must forgive me, gentlemen," he began, "for calling without prior arrangement, but I am at my wit's end. Something frightful has occurred at Ravensby." "Please be seated," Holmes said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Begin at the beginning, Mr. Addison. Spare no detail, however trifling." The headmaster nodded. "It began 3 nights ago. One of our senior pupils, James Wyndham, was discovered lying senseless in the school courtyard just before midnight. He had gone out, apparently, to retrieve a textbook left in the lecture hall. When he failed to return, a teacher sent to look for him found the boy collapsed near the garden pond. "Was he injured?" I asked. "No sign of trauma. The physician who examined him said it was as though Wyndham had suffered a sudden and inexplicable seizure. He remains unconscious to this day." Holmes' eyes glittered with sudden interest. "And what of this pond?" Mr. Addison hesitated. "Is where the matter grows most curious. Our groundskeeper, Mr. Benlow, reported something most unnatural. He claimed that at the time Wyndham was discovered, the pond, which ordinarily reflects the building and the moonlight, most clearly showed no reflection whatsoever. None at all. It was as though the surface were painted black. There was silence for a moment, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Then Holmes leaned forward, his voice almost playful. "A puddle that does not reflect," he said softly. "Now that Watson is a marvel worth investigating." Addison looked from one to the other of us with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "There is one more matter," he added. The boy was clutching something in his hand, a broken piece of mirror. Holmes' fingers drummed rapidly on the arm of his chair. "Most suggestive. And the glass, was it sharp?" "Yes, freshly broken by all appearance." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "And I presume you have retained it." "I brought it with me," said Addison, producing a cloth-wrapped object from his coat. "I thought it safer in your hands than ours." Holmes took the fragment gently, holding it to the light. It caught the glow of the fireplace, but reflected no image. His brow furrowed. "Watson," he said suddenly, "you recall the case of the barrow-in-furnace reflection that was not a reflection?" "Only vaguely. A peculiar incident involving a window that showed a face which never entered the room. I wonder." He stood abruptly and moved to the window, where the rain continued to fall with quiet persistence. "Mr. Addison, we shall accompany you to East Sussex by the noon train tomorrow. I trust there is lodging available for Dr. Watson and myself." "Certainly. We shall have rooms prepared at the headmaster's house." "Excellent. And one last question. Has anything like this ever happened before at Ravensby?" Mr. Addison looked distinctly uncomfortable. "There was one incident," he admitted. "Years ago, a boy vanished entirely from the grounds during a winter storm. No trace of him was ever found." Holmes turned back from the window, the ghost of a smile on his lips. "The game, Watson," he said softly, "is afoot." As Mr. Addison departed into the wet London afternoon, I observed his boots, as Holmes had hinted. The mud clinging to them was not London clay, but a redder, grittier soil common to the fields of Sussex, if memory served. Holmes, meanwhile, returned to the armchair and stared once more into the fire. But this time his eyes were not idle. They burned with the promise of mystery. Somewhere in the quiet corridors of a schoolhouse, beneath the rain-washed eaves and ancient brickwork, something waited in shadow, and we were going to meet it. Chapter 2: The Boy and the Mirror. Shard, the following day, broke sullen and grey, with a veil of drizzle clinging stubbornly to the rooftops of London. Holmes and I boarded the noon train from Victoria Station with little ceremony. Holmes, characteristically indifferent to weather and waiting porters alike, carried only a slender valise and the cloth-wrapped shard of mirror, which he had refused to let out of his sight. I had packed more conventionally for a brief stay, including a few medical essentials in case the afflicted boy's condition demanded my attention. Holmes was unusually taciturn during the journey, content to sit in our first-class compartment with his chin pressed against the knuckles of one gloved hand. He neither smoked nor spoke, save for a brief and unexpected inquiry midway through the Sussex countryside. "Watson," he said, "what do you make of reflective surfaces that cease to reflect?" I looked up from my newspaper. "Well, one could attribute it to lighting conditions, surface impurities, or natural explanations," Holmes interrupted, waving a finger. "Indeed. But let us imagine the surface was clean, the light present, and the laws of physics obedient. What then? I hesitated. Then I should think we are either facing a delusion or something engineered. Holmes offered a rare approving nod. Precisely. Either the witnesses are mistaken, and we must never underestimate the pliability of human perception, or someone wished the reflection gone and arranged matters accordingly. In either case, it is no longer a matter of water and light, but of motive and mind. I made no reply, but the memory of Mr. Addison's pale, nervous manner remained with me. There was more to this affair than schoolboy misadventure. I was certain of it. We arrived at Ravensby School just past 3 in the afternoon. A groom met us at the small station with a creaking trap, and we rode in silence through a lane, bordered by crumbling stone walls and tall yew trees that leaned inward like old men whispering secrets. The school itself was a red-brick Georgian structure with ivy crawling across its facade and a bell tower that loomed over the courtyard. Like a vigilant sentinel, Addison met us on the front steps. His expression was taut, but he greeted us with gratitude and ushered us inside without delay. Holmes declined refreshment and insisted on being taken directly to the scene of the incident, the courtyard and the pond. "If you please," he said, already striding down the corridor with his coat still damp from the ride. We crossed through the main hall and emerged into a broad quadrangle. The gravel path looped round a garden at the center, and there, nestled against a cluster of rhododendron bushes, was the pond of all no more than 15 feet across, its stone border neat and well kept. Holmes approached with the caution of a naturalist observing a venomous specimen. The surface of the pond was calm, save for the whisper of rain disturbing its mirror sheen. Holmes crouched and studied the water closely, his face inches from the surface, drab sky, steady light. "Yet a faint reflection is present today," he murmured. "And 3 nights ago, perfectly clear," Addison replied. "Moonlit, though overcast, and yet no reflection, none." Holmes glanced toward the garden wall, where a low iron fence separated the school from the wood beyond. "This location is not without privacy. Were any witnesses present?" "Only the teacher, who found the boy, a Mr. Larch." "And the boy?" "Still unconscious. Dr. Elbridge, our physician, is at his side." Holmes straightened. "We shall see him shortly. But first, where was the mirror found?" Addison led us a few paces away to where a patch of gravel had been swept aside. "Here," clutched in his right hand. Holmes knelt again. "And no mirror is missing from the school. None we can identify, not from dormitories, washrooms, or staff quarters." Holmes's brow furrowed as he unwrapped the shard once more and held it beside the pond's water. "Curious," he murmured. "There is no silvering. This is a modern mirror, backed with film rather than polished metal. A detail Watson may find dull, but to me it is a whisper." We made our way back inside, where Addison led us up a narrow staircase to the infirmary. The boy, James Wyndham, lay still upon a cot by the window, his features pallid and slack. A nurse rose from her chair and nodded respectfully. Holmes barely acknowledged her. Instead, he approached the bed with surprising gentleness, studying the boy's face. "How long unconscious?" he asked. 3 nights. There was a flutter of movement yesterday, but no true awakening." I stepped forward and conducted a brief examination. "Pulse weak, but regular. No signs of fever or trauma. There's no concussion, nor evidence of seizures, no muscle rigidity, no tongue biting. Indeed, Holmes murmured. And yet he sleeps, as if kept from waking. He turned suddenly to the nurse. Has he spoken? Even in delirium? No, sir. Holmes glanced at Addison. And Wyndham's disposition? Was he a troubled boy? Addison hesitated. He was. Intelligent, independent, sometimes aloof, but never cruel. There was one matter, though he had recently taken an interest in an old chapel ruin on the far end of the property. A strange place most of the boys avoided. Holmes's eyes lit faintly. Old ruins, a mirror with no source, and a pond that refuses to reflect. We begin to assemble the pieces, Watson. And what do they form? I asked. Holmes gave a thin smile. Ah, but you know my answer. Not yet a picture, but the frame intrigues me. As we left the infirmary, the first toll of the chapel bell echoed distantly from the tower above. It was a flat, unlovely sound, but it struck a chill in my bones nonetheless. Holmes paused mid-step and looked upward. Do you know, Watson, he said, some things do not cast reflections, not because of what they are, but because of what they are hiding. And with that cryptic remark, we stepped into the deepening dusk, the shadows of Ravensby lengthening behind us. Chapter 3. The ruin at the edge of the wood the following morning brought no improvement in the weather nor the condition of young Wyndham. Holmes rose early, restless and sharped, his breakfast untouched, sat cooling on the tray while he thumbed absently through an old volume on ecclesiastical architecture he had found in the headmaster's study the night before. There is something unnatural in the air here, Watson, he remarked as he closed the book with a snap. Not in the spiritual sense, you understand, but in the carefully cultivated silence. These halls are too still. Ravensby hides more than it shows. Perhaps it is the nature of boarding schools to be secretive, I suggested, setting down my tea. Boys will always harbor mischief, and teachers, no, Holmes interrupted. This is not the harmless mischief of boys. It is an older, more practiced concealment. It clings to the bricks. Come, Watson, the chapel ruins await. Mr. Addison had given us directions to the site the previous evening with more reluctance than I had expected. The boys call it Whisper Hollow, he had said with a wan smile. They tell stories about it, foolish tales, but persistent. Most of them stay away. We followed a narrow path past the school's northern wall, through an overgrown gate that once bore an inscription now worn blank by time. Beyond lay a gentle slope, where weeds choked the earth and the trees grew too closely together for comfort. As we pressed onward, the gravel gave way to damp soil, and the forest seemed to hush with our approach. The ruin emerged slowly from the fog, like a forgotten memory. What had once been a small stone chapel now stood roofless. Its central arch collapsed. Moss carpeted the walls. Ivy dangled like veins from broken corners. Yet, amidst this decay, Holmes moved as if in a cathedral. It has the bones of a 14th-century structure, he said, brushing a hand across one weathered column. Note the tracery on the stone, delicate work for such a provincial setting. I stood in the doorway, peering at the broken nave. A cracked stone basin, perhaps a font lay, overturned in the corner. The place smelled of cold and damp rot, and something else. something metallic beneath the moss. Holmes crouched beside a portion of the flagstone floor and withdrew a small blade from his pocket. With deft movements, he scraped away the moss, revealing a sigil etched into the stone, a circle enclosing a diamond shape with a faint groove bisecting both. It was rough and ancient. "See here, Watson," he said, gesturing. "Someone carved this deliberately. Not part of the original structure. This has none of the age wear of the walls. And more importantly, the groove has fresh scratches, recently disturbed. Indeed, someone has been here within the last week, I'd wager." We explored further, circling the ruin's rear wall, where a crumbling alcove stood partially concealed by yew branches. Holmes paused as we reached it and pointed to the ground. A faint indentation in the mud revealed the edge of a boot print, slender, precise, and with a heel worn slightly on the inside, the same footprint as Mr. Addison's. "If I am not mistaken," Holmes muttered, "he has visited this place recently, despite his reluctance to speak of it. Surely many of the staff might walk these grounds." Holmes shook his head. "Not many leave identical impressions to those I saw on the steps outside our room. Addison's gait is distinctive. See the deeper pressure here on the ball of the foot. He is a man who walks often on stone." He straightened and gazed back toward the school. "I wonder what he seeks in a ruin his pupils fear." We turned to leave, but something glinted beneath the undergrowth. Holmes knelt swiftly and retrieved a narrow shard of glassnut. Unlike the one Wyndham had held, it was duller, weathered by exposure, and the edges less jagged, but unmistakably of the same make. "A second piece," I said. "Or a previous one," Holmes corrected, studying the shard. "This has lain here longer. We are not looking at a single incident, Watson. We are walking through layers." Back at the school, we encountered a boy of about 14, freckled, sharpened, and clearly watching our return. He stood beneath a cloister arch, arms folded, pretending to inspect a textbook far too intently. Holmes stopped in his tracks. "Good morning," he said affably. "Might I ask your name?" The boy hesitated, then lifted his chin. "Daniel Prentice, sir. Were you a friend of James Wyndham?" Daniel's mouth tightened. "Not exactly. He didn't talk to many people." Holmes crouched slightly, bringing himself to the boy's level. "And what of the chapel ruins? Have you been there?" Daniel blinked. "We're not supposed to, but I've been, once, recently." Daniel hesitated. "A few weeks ago. It was before James got hurt." Holmes said nothing, but his eyes studied the boy with unblinking precision. "Did he go there?" I asked gently. Daniel nodded. "He said he'd found something. A book. Said it had no words, just pictures. Showed me a page. Once it looked like maps, but wrong." "What do you mean, wrong?" Holmes asked. "Like, it wasn't of anywhere. But the lines were perfect. Too perfect." He kept going back, and now Daniel looked down. "He said the pond was showing things. He thought it was trying to tell him something." Holmes rose slowly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Master Prentice. You've been most helpful." We watched the boy hurry off, his boots tapping against the wet stone. Holmes turned to me as the wind stirred the trees beyond the courtyard. "Maps that lead nowhere, a pond that speaks, and symbols carved where no priest would bless them." He exhaled slowly. "No, Watson. This is no ordinary mischief. This is a design." I looked toward the chapel ruins, now hidden by mist. "A design of what?" Holmes's reply was quiet, of a mind trying desperately to be seen without ever being reflected. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Shadows. That evening, as twilight curled like smoke across the damp grounds of Ravensby, Holmes requested that Mr. Addison summon the faculty to the drawing-room. The headmaster complied, albeit with stiff unease, and by 7:30 we found ourselves gathered around a circular table lit by a single gas lamp. The flame hissed faintly in the gloom. Present were 5 individuals besides Holmes, myself, and Addison: Mr. Cedric Larch, the teacher who had discovered young Wyndham; Miss Clarice Dovecot, the literature mistress; Dr. Elbridge, the school physician; Mr. Harold Benlow; and finally Mr. Terence Flack, a portly mathematics master with a clipped beard and spectacles that shimmered like coins. Holmes stood with one arm behind his back, his gaze drifting lazily across the group. He looked not unlike a lecturer preparing to address a reluctant assembly. "Thank you all for coming," he began with calm precision. "Dr. Watson and I are grateful for your cooperation in this matter. I shall be brief, for I find brevity, like fire, most effective when controlled." There were a few polite chuckles. Flack tapped his fingers on the table. Dovecot avoided Holmes's eyes. "As you all know," Holmes continued, "James Wyndham remains unconscious following an incident by the garden pond. The facts are scarce. He was found collapsed, clutching a shard of mirror. No physical injuries, no known medical cause. The pond, by at least one account, ceased to reflect light." Mr. Larch coughed gently. "That was what Mr. Benlow claimed, I believe." Holmes turned. "Indeed, Mr. Benlow, might you elaborate?" The groundskeeper, a ruddy man with wind-chafed cheeks, shifted uncomfortably. "Aye, sir. It were like the water turned to ink. I was out checking the south gates, came back and saw the boy being lifted by Mr. Larch, but the pond looked wrong, flat, like it didn't belong." "Did you see your own reflection?" Holmes asked. Benlow shook his head. "Not a flicker." Holmes's expression did not change. "You say it didn't belong. What do you mean?" "I mean," Benlow hesitated, his weathered face darkening, "I mean it looked like a hole, like it wasn't pond water at all, but something else, waiting." Silence settled. Miss Dovecot shifted in her chair. Holmes turned his attention to her. "You seem disturbed, Miss Dovecot. Have you encountered the pond behaving oddly?" She stiffened. "I don't concern myself with schoolyard superstitions, but James Wyndham was your pupil in literature, was he not?" "He was a quiet boy, gifted with metaphor. Did he ever share metaphors with you? About the pond, or the chapel ruins?" A flicker of hesitation. "He once wrote a verse for an assignment, something about a mirror that swallowed. I thought it imaginative nonsense. Would you still have this verse?" She blinked. "It may be in my desk. I shall look." "Please do," Holmes said. Then he turned to Mr. Larch. "You found the boy. What can you tell us?" Larch, a thin, nervous man with parchment skin, cleared his throat. "I had sent James to retrieve a notebook from the lecture hall. When he failed to return, I went looking. I found him lying beside the pond, still as stone. His hand bled slightly from the mirror fragment. Was anyone else nearby?" "No, sir. No one I saw." Holmes tilted his head. "And had you any occasion to visit the chapel ruins?" Larch faltered. "No. Not recently." "Not recently," Holmes repeated. "So, you have been. Larch looked to Addison, who offered no reprieve. Yes, Larch admitted. I went there last term. I was researching a local ghost story the boys spread about the place. I thought it useful for my creative writing lesson. And did you find anything of interest? Larch hesitated. The remains of a fire, and markings on the stone. Carvings. I took them for idle mischief. Holmes turned slowly toward the last person at the table, Dr. Elbridge, the school's physician. And you, Dr. Dew, you believe James Wyndham is suffering from an illness of the body. Elbridge, a bearded man with a heavy brow, shook his head. No, I've examined the boy twice daily since the incident. There are no signs of trauma, neurological or otherwise. His vital signs remain steady, but I've seen nothing like it. Then how would you describe his condition? A fugue state? Or perhaps a form of catalepsy, though neither explains the trigger. Holmes nodded slowly, eyes distant. Very well. I thank you all. Addison cleared his throat. Mr. Holmes, may I ask, do you believe something unnatural is at work? Holmes gave the faintest of smiles. I believe only in observation, Mr. Addison, and the things people work very hard to obscure. We broke for the evening soon after. The staff dispersed in silence, though I noted Flack remained behind momentarily to murmur something to Addison too softly for us to hear. Holmes, already donning his overcoat, whispered to me as we stepped into the corridor, Flack is worried, but not about the boy. I shall speak to him privately. We walked the shadowed hallways of Ravensby in silence for a time. The lamps flickered under the breath of unseen drafts. Somewhere far off, a door creaked open and closed again. There's something else, Watson, Holmes said quietly. The boy's collapse, the mirror, the pond, all strange enough. But what troubles me most is what Daniel Prentice said about the book. No, about the maps. Maps that led nowhere. That is not a boy's phrase. That is an adult's. He repeated something he overheard. And from whom? That, Holmes said, his eyes narrowing, is the question. Outside, the night pressed heavy against the windows. I felt the cold deepen in my bones, not from temperature, but from the sense of many eyes watching from the stone walls of Ravensby. Not boys, not staff, but shadows, gathering, waiting, reflecting nothing. Chapter 5. The mirror that wasn't missing that night. Sleep eluded me. The steady drizzle outside our window whispered against the panes like fingers drawing messages in mist. Even Holmes, who had once famously fallen asleep with a live viper in the room, remained wakeful. He sat upright in bed, propped with pillows, the mirror shard held up to the gaslight, as though hoping it might speak. I finally broke the silence. Do you believe the shard and the boy's condition are directly connected? Holmes did not turn. I do not believe in coincidence, Watson. Not when symbols lie beneath moss and children speak of maps that describe nothing. The mirror is a vessel, not of reflection, but of influence. You're suggesting it was used for some sort of manipulation. He finally looked at me. I suggest only that its presence is no accident. We must determine where it came from, and if it has a twin. At breakfast the next morning, Holmes requested an audience with Miss Dovecot under the pretense of discussing Wyndham's writing. She arrived in the staff library shortly after, carrying a thin folder of papers bound in twine. Her expression was wary. I found the verse he wrote, she said, handing it to Holmes, though I doubt it will be of help. It's fanciful, abstract. Holmes untied the folder and scanned the lines swiftly. I leaned closer and read over his shoulder, in water's skin where eyes should see. A second self slips silently. What casts no face, recalls no name, yet teaches boys a staring game. The pond is not the pond you knew. The mirror breaks, and so do you. Holmes exhaled slowly. Not a composition I'd expect from a schoolboy. Miss Dovecot nodded. It unsettled me at the time. I marked it highly, but, well, it stayed with me. Did he speak of the chapel? Holmes asked. Only once, she admitted. He asked if it had ever been rebuilt. I told him it hadn't stood whole in generations. Holmes closed the folder gently. And what of this book with maps? Miss Dovecot blinked. Pardon? The one Daniel Prentice mentioned. A book Wyndham found, with no words, strange maps. She shook her head. He never spoke to me of any such book, but if he had it, it's likely in his dormitory. Holmes rose at once. Then let us pay it a visit. Wyndham's dormitory was a small, shared room in the east wing, sparsely furnished. A narrow bed, a wooden desk, and a locker were all that made up his corner. Holmes moved through it with swift efficiency, examining the drawer interiors with a gloved hand and scanning every spine on the small shelf above the bed. He paused at the last book. It was a faded volume bound in black canvas, the edges worn with use. There was no title on the cover or spine. Watson, he said quietly, tell me what you see. I opened the book and turned the first few pages, blank. Then a page with a circular diagramma compass rose of sorts, but with unfamiliar cardinal markings. The next page bore what resembled a topographical map, but the landforms were impossible. Staircases built across valleys, a forest shaped like a spiral, and symbols that resembled runes rather than letters. No names, I said, no dates. These aren't real places. Holmes took the book back and flipped to the center. There, a fold-out sheet had been tucked carefully within. He unfolded it with surgical care. It showed a pond, clearly rendered the very shape of the one outside. But at its center, where the water should be blank, there was a detailed drawing of a mirror floating upright in the surface, splitting the image above and below. On one side was the school in daylight. On the other, the chapel ruins, rendered intact. Holmes stared at it for a long time. This is not a boy's fantasy. This is instruction. Instruction, I echoed. Someone gave him this, Watson. Someone wanted him to follow its path, to test the boundary between reflection and reality. He folded the map and slipped it into his coat. There is one more place we must go. Where? To where all reflections originate, he said. The glass. Holmes requested that Addison grant us access to the school's supply cellar, where maintenance materials and replacement fixtures were kept. The old headmaster complied, though not without visible reluctance. We haven't catalogued that area in some time, he said. The records are disorganized. I prefer disorganized places, Holmes replied, leading the way down a narrow staircase lit by sputtering lanterns. The cellar was vast and musty. Dust lay thick on unused chairs, broken desks, and a crated piano missing half its keys. Holmes moved past these with barely a glance. His attention was drawn instead to a row of wooden panels stacked against the far wall mirrors. Mostly, in varying states of disrepair. He examined them carefully, one by one. "This one," he said at last, lifting a frame with a cracked surface. "Note the missing triangle at the bottom right. Watson, compare it to the shard Wyndham held." I produced the cloth-wrapped fragment and aligned it with the missing portion. It matched precisely. "Then this is the source," I said. "Yes, but not merely of glass, of obsession." Holmes turned to Addison. "How did this mirror end up in storage?" Addison frowned. "I believe it cracked last term. Larch reported it broken. He had it removed." Holmes went still. "Mr. Larch?" "Yes." "Why?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Because Mr. Larch lied to us. He said he hadn't been to the chapel ruins recently. But this mirror was part of his classroom, was it not?" Addison nodded. "The old lecture hall. He taught senior literature there." Holmes was silent for a beat. Then he turned and climbed the stairs with haste. "I must speak with Mr. Larch again," he said over his shoulder. "He may not be our villain, Watson, but he knows who is." And as we emerged into the lightless afternoon, I felt the sensation again, that chill upon the spine. The sensation not of wind nor of watching, but of something waiting behind the veil of glass, something that watched without being seen, something that mirrored nothing. Chapter 6. A hidden inconsistency. We found Mr. Larch in the old lecture hall, seated behind a wide desk littered with papers and ink blotters, his fingers steepled in anxious repose. He rose as we entered, the light from the high, dust-clouded windows casting a cage-like lattice across his pale features. "Mr. Holmes," he said, voice tight. "I hadn't expected." "I seldom arrive where I'm expected," Holmes replied, stepping forward. "Tell me, Mr. Larch, do you recall a mirror that once hung in this room?" Larch glanced toward the northern wall, where a lighter patch of paint betrayed where something large had once been mounted. "Yes, it cracked some months ago during a storm. I had it removed." "By whom?" "I filed a request, as is custom." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, do you recall the shard Wyndham held?" "Perfectly." Holmes pulled the cloth from his pocket and unfolded it on the desk. "It matches a missing corner of the mirror found in the cellar. The same mirror from this very room." Larch leaned in to study the piece. His fingers twitched, but he did not touch it. Holmes continued, tone casual. "Interesting, then, that you told us you had not been near the ruins in recent weeks, though we found a bootprint matching yours. And now this mirror, once in your care, found in the hands of a student who ventured there on his own. All threads lead back to you, Mr. Larch." "I didn't give it to him," Larch said, his voice rising. "He must have taken it on his own. James was... he was drawn to things, fixated. I tried to stop him." "But you knew he'd been going to the ruins." Larch hesitated. "Yes, and the book. I saw him with it once. I asked where he'd got it. He said it found him. I thought it a fancy. But after he collapsed, I saw what he'd drawn in the margins. I realized it wasn't just invention." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "You still have these drawings?" Larch reached beneath his desk and removed a leather-bound book, well-worn and heavy. "His writing portfolio," he said, sliding it toward Holmes. "I didn't tell Addison. I couldn't." Holmes opened the book. The pages were thick with diagrams, some mirrored, some circular, some resembling celestial charts with impossible alignments. One page showed a crude sketch of the pond, split into top and bottom by a mirror surface. In the lower half, a figure blurred, hunched stood, alone, in an inverted school. Holmes closed the book slowly. And yet, despite your knowledge of all this, you claimed ignorance. Why? Larch sat down heavily. Because I was frightened. I saw him change, Mr. Holmes. Not in madness, but in silence. He stopped asking questions. He began waiting for something to come through. Holmes glanced at me. Not madness, obsession. We left Larch under instructions not to speak to anyone further without Holmes's permission. Outside, the air had grown sharper, the wind cutting off the sea in low, whispering bursts. We made our way back toward the central hall, and Holmes spoke low and fast. He's not lying now, he said, but he withheld the truth too long. And that book, Watson, it is no mere sketchbook. I have seen symbols like those before. Do you recall the Bramwell case? The house in Wiltshire with the underground chamber. Of course, same geometry, same false symmetries, and the same unsettling suggestion maps, not of place, but of direction. The difference lies in where one points. We returned to our quarters just after noon. Holmes laid Wyndham's portfolio beside the black map book from the dormitory. He arranged pages side by side. Watson, look at these two. At first glance, unrelated. But now, align this page with the mirror shard as divider. He did so, and the images clicked together like two puzzle halves. The edges of one symbol matched the continuation in the other. My word, I murmured. They were meant to be joined, exactly. That is the hidden inconsistency. No student stumbles upon such design. Someone instructed him, either directly or indirectly, through this book. And now we must ask, where did the book originate? At that moment, a knock sounded at our door. Mr. Benlow stood in the corridor, rain on his shoulders and mud on his boots. Begging your pardon, he said, looking uneasily over his shoulder. But there's something you ought to see. He led us to the small storage shed near the ponda rusted, lopsided structure used for tools. Inside, he lit a lantern and pointed toward a shelf behind several broken rakes. There lay a bundle wrapped in oilskin. Found it this morning, he said. One of the younger boys said he saw someone sneaking around the shed last night. Holmes stepped forward and unwrapped the bundle. Inside was another mirror, this one intact. But unlike the first, it was narrow, oblong, and cold to the touch, despite the closed space. Its surface was warped, not cracked, but as if the glass had been pulled subtly inwards, bending ever so slightly toward the center. Holmes stared into it for several long moments. No reflection, he whispered. Indeed, where I expected to see his face, I saw only darkness, depthless, shifting darkness. He rapped it again. This is not broken. It is unfinished. And it was left here recently. Someone wanted it hidden. Benlow stepped back, crossing himself. I don't like it, sir. Feels wrong in the air. I've worked this ground 20 years and never seen a thing like it. Holmes met his gaze. Nor have I. Back in our quarters, Holmes placed the second mirror beside the shard and sat, folding his fingers together. There is no doubt now. Someone brought that object here. Someone with knowledge of that ruin, of its history and of James Wyndham's mind. He rose and paced slowly. I must now ask a question I had hoped to avoid? What if this is not merely the residue of obsession, but a deliberate act of engineering? Psychological, perhaps. Or something older. A mechanism of belief. I stared at him. You think the mirror is causing this? I think, Holmes said, voice low, that someone is attempting to build a doorway, not with bricks or mortar, but with reflections. And James Wyndham was the first to knock. We stood in silence, the rain ticking against the window, as if the very walls of Ravensby were waiting for something to answer. Chapter 7. The night of the second reflection. It was just past midnight when the knock came, a soft, hesitant tap that roused me from a light sleep and found Holmes already standing by the door, fully dressed. He opened it without a word. It was Daniel Prentice. The boy stood in his dressing gown, pale and trembling, a candle clutched in both hands. Mr. Holmes, he whispered, you said to tell you if anything strange happened again. Holmes knelt, eye level with the child. Go on. I couldn't sleep, Daniel said. And I saw the pond. From the window in the corridor, it was dark, but not like night. Dark like something was covering it, like a lid. There was no moonlight in it, not even the candlelight. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dim flame. And did you see anyone else? Daniel hesitated. Yes, Mr. Flack. I saw him crossing the courtyard just after. He wasn't using a lantern. Did he look toward the pond? The boy nodded. He stopped right at the edge, just stood there, not moving. Holmes rose. Watson boots. I dressed swiftly, and we followed the boy down the stairwell into the cold hush of the school's east corridor. The gaslights burned low here, hissing faintly, and the night beyond the window was thick with mist. As we reached the glass, Holmes placed his palm lightly against it. The boy's right, he murmured. No reflection at all. Even the panes don't catch the torchlight. He turned sharply to the pond. Outside, the fog thickened to near opacity. The air was wet and heavy, clinging to the skin like gauze. We moved slowly, the gravel path muffled beneath our boots. The pond emerged only when we were nearly upon it, black, still, a void of light surrounded by trembling reeds. No stars, no sky, no trees, just absence. And on its bank stood Mr. Flack. He faced the water, with his back to us, utterly motionless. The toes of his shoes met the pond's edge precisely. In his right hand, at his side, hung a small square object, too rigid for a book, too slender for a box. A mirror, Holmes whispered. We approached quietly. Holmes made no move to call out. Instead, he stopped a few paces behind the man and spoke as though beginning a lesson. It is curious, Mr. Flack, how few people understand the true function of a mirror. They imagine it merely reflects, but it does not. It interprets. And when one is clever enough, obsessed enough, one might teach it to interpret something else. Flack did not move, but his fingers clenched tighter around the object. I had wondered where the second mirror had gone. Holmes continued. The one designed to take in rather than reflect out. The missing link. You didn't destroy it, after all. You simply reworked it. Now Flack turned his head just slightly, just enough to reveal a sliver of his profile. His eyes were wild, pupils wide and unfixed. You don't understand, he said. None of you understand. It's not dangerous, it's instructional. Holmes took a step closer. What did you hope to find, Mr. Flack? What lies beyond reflection? Flack's breath steamed in the cold air. Understanding the truth. They thought I was a mathematician, but numbers are just keys, symbols, coordinates. This place it called back when I wrote the sequence, it answered, through the boy. He's still holding the door, Flack said hoarsely. He's still seeing. But he can't cross. He's trapped between, because of you. Flack turned at last. His face was pale, lips cracked, and in his hands, narrow and black-edged, the surface dull like smoked glass. No image met us from within. He wanted to look, Flack whispered. He kept looking, so I gave him the means. Holmes's voice dropped. You manipulated a child into conducting your experiment. Flack stepped back toward the pond. He volunteered. I moved then, instinctively, but Holmes caught my arm. Let him speak, he murmured. Flack raised the mirror toward the pond. It needs symmetry, he said, one on each side. That's how the passage aligns. That's how the reflection becomes real. And then he dropped the mirror. It struck the surface with a quiet splash and did not break. It did not sink, either. It floated upright, just like in the drawing. The pond seemed to shift. A low hum-neither sound nor vibration rose through the ground beneath our feet. The air warped subtly. Behind the mist, I glimpsed something ripple within the black surface, something reaching upward. Holmes was already moving, with no warning. He rushed to the water's edge and yanked Flack backward by his coat. The man resisted, but Holmes was stronger, and together we pulled him away from the edge. As we did, the mirror tipped and finally slid beneath the surface. The ripple vanished. The pond was once more still, and now the moon returned its pale light visible on the water once more. As if the spell had broken, we dragged Flack, dazed and gasping, back to the path. Holmes knelt beside him, eyes blazing. You're lucky it didn't pull you in, he said. You're lucky it didn't succeed. Flack stared upward. I saw it. What? The other side. Holmes said nothing. We left Flack in the care of Addison and the local constable, who arrived shortly after dawn. Holmes reported the man's mental state as fragile but coherent. No crime could be neatly charged, but Holmes insisted the school remove him indefinitely. We stood once more by the pond as morning broke. It looked harmless again, mundane, a patch of water surrounded by moss and reeds. Holmes shook his head. There's a reason reflections vanish in darkness, Watson. They are not meant to be doorways. I looked at the water, and for a moment I thought I saw deep in its center faint shimmer, like a pupil dilating, watching. Waiting. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The morning after Flack's arrest found Holmes uncharacteristically still. He stood at the window of our guest room, the pale light of day casting him in near silhouette, his gaze fixed upon the distant pond that now shimmered innocently in the sunshine. His tea cooled untouched beside him. For once, he seemed deep in thought, not from exhilaration, but from caution. You fear it isn't over, I said gently. Holmes did not move. Fear is too strong a word. But no, I do not believe the curtain has fallen, only shifted. He turned at last, his face unreadable. Watson, he said, what do you make of young Wyndham's condition now that Flack has been removed from the equation? He remains unconscious, I replied. No change in respiration or neural activity. stable but unresponsive. Precisely, and therein lies the puzzle. If Flack's actions alone had created the disturbance, one might expect the boy to recover once the source was removed. But he does not. I frowned. Then you believe Flack was not the architect? Holmes shook his head. Not the architect, no. The practitioner, perhaps. A man dabbling in structure without understanding its full dimensions. But something else, shaped this mechanism. The boy merely followed the lines drawn for him. Then what do you propose? Holmes moved to the desk, where he opened Wyndham's portfolio and the black map book once more. I propose, he said, that this was never about a mirror, or even a pond. It was about perception and misdirection. He pulled 2 pages, free one from each book, and laid them side by side. Look closely. At first, the drawings seemed unrelated. One, a series of overlapping circles and angled lines. The other, a mirrored corridor descending beneath a structure I assumed to be the chapel. But when Holmes folded the first sheet along a faint crease and placed it over the second, the diagrams merged, forming a single image, a downward spiral. A stair, I said, or a tunnel. Holmes nodded. A descent. One that exists not physically, but symbolically, through ritual, belief, obsession. And if one descends far enough, one loses the ability to return, he said softly. Unless. He stood abruptly. Come, Watson. We are going to wake the boy. I blinked. You believe that's possible? Holmes retrieved the intact mirror from the shed, the one recovered before it sank into the pond, and wrapped it in black cloth. Not certain, but I believe it worth testing a theory. We made our way to the infirmary, where Nurse Kemp greeted us with tired eyes. She had remained by Wyndham's bedside through the night. No change, Mr. Holmes, she said. He stirs now and again, but he does not wake. Holmes nodded. I will not disturb him directly, but I ask for a moment alone. The nurse hesitated, then left with a worried glance at me. I closed the door behind her. Holmes approached the bed and set the cloth-wrapped mirror on the stand beside the boy. His face was still and pale as parchment, his chest rising and falling with eerie calm. Then Holmes did something unexpected. He took a piece of chalk from his coat and began to draw on the flora circle surrounding the bed, with precise lines and geometric forms branching outward. Some symbols I recognized from Wyndham's sketches. Others were older. You believe these shapes will have an effect? I asked, my voice low. Only if the effect already exists, he replied. I do not summon it, is not in my creed. But I can replicate. And this is the structure, he responded to. He lit a single lantern and set it beside the mirror. Then, with a final glance at me, he unwrapped the glass dot. At first, nothing happened. But then, slowly, the light in the room shifted not in brightness, but in direction. Shadows grew slightly sharper, angles less certain. The mirror reflected the boy, yet not as he lay now. The image showed his eyes, open, gazing upward. Holmes, I breathed, stepping closer. That's not possible. Watch, Holmes, said Dot, and the image blinked. Wyndham's chest hitched. A small sound, barely a breath, escaped his lips. His fingers twitched. Holmes leaned in. James Wyndham, he said firmly, you are not between. You are here. You are in the world that reflects, not the one that absorbs. Do you understand me? The boy's eyelids fluttered. He exhaled sharply and opened his eyes. I rushed forward, checking his pulse. It had grown stronger. Color was returning to his cheeks. Holmes lowered the cloth over the mirror again. Instantly, the air returned to normal, as though a tension had been snapped. Wyndham looked at us, confused and pale. "The stairs," he whispered. "They never stopped going down." "You're safe now," I said gently. "No," he murmured, closing his eyes. "It's not done." "He was just the first one," they answered. Holmes turned to me, his voice low. "There's another, Watson." "Another what?" "Another pupil, another map reader, another door." I stared at Holmes, the words sinking in. We had not closed the passage. We had merely found its key. Chapter 9. The ink that drew itself. The storm broke at dusk. Rain fell in thin, cutting sheets, whipped by wind that keened across the eaves of Ravensby like a warning in a foreign tongue. Within our quarters, Holmes moved with methodical purpose. The black-covered map book now splayed open on the desk, and young Wyndham's drawings arranged in concentric spirals around it, pinned with ink bottles and wax seals. "You saw how the boy responded," Holmes said without looking up. "Not to sound, nor to touch, but to structure, the form of things. The invitation was mathematical, Watson, and he accepted it with the gaze of an initiate." I nodded, though my mind remained fixed on the boy's final words. "Another." "What of Daniel Prentice?" I asked. He knew too much. The mirror, the maps, Wyndham's changes. Holmes tapped his fingers rapidly on the page. "Indeed." And his testimony was riddled with borrowed language. He repeated phrases without understanding them. I thought at the time they belonged to Wyndham or to Larch, but now I wonder if they came from somewhere older. A knock interrupted us. It was Mr. Addison, his cloak soaked through, his mustache drooping from the damp. "Gentlemen," he said gravely, "we've had an incident." Holmes stood at once. "Where?" "In the dormitories," Addison said. "Another boy, George Maitland, was found kneeling at the base of his bed, not unconscious, but entirely unresponsive, staring at the wall. We called to him, shook him, even threatened him. He didn't blink." Holmes was already pulling on his coat. "Bring us there at once." We followed the headmaster through winding corridors, slick with condensation. Oil lamps guttered in the draught, casting our shadows, long and tremulous. At the far end of the third-floor dormitory hall, we entered a small room where 3 beds were arranged in military fashion. The 2 nearest were unoccupied. The third held a boy, perhaps 13, seated rigidly on the floor beside it, hands resting on his knees, gaze locked on the wall with unnerving stillness. George Maitland. His eyes were wide but glassy, his lips parted as if mid-sentence, though no sound emerged. Holmes knelt in front of him, waved a hand before his face, then placed his fingers gently on the boy's wrist. "Pulse is strong," he murmured. "Breathing shallow but steady. A state of induced trance, perhaps, but not natural." "Was there anything in the room with him?" I asked Addison. The headmaster hesitated. "Yes, this." He stepped aside and gestured to the bed's foot, where a single sheet of paper lay spread flat across the wooden chest. A drawing. Holmes leaned over it, eyes narrowing. Fresh ink, not dry. The lines were sharp and geometric to mirrored arches crossing above a circle. At their center, a shaded void. Surrounding it, the words, "What does not reflect may still observe," A silence passed between us. Holmes reached out and touched the paper gently. Then he turned it over. Blank, no maker's mark, no indentation, no signature. He turned to Addison. Who discovered him? Another boy, Samuel Thorne. He came to fetch George for supper. Said he found him kneeling like this. Where is Thorne now? In the dining hall. Send for him immediately, Holmes said. And bring Daniel Prentice as well. We waited in the room as thunder muttered above. The boy remained unmoved, as if listening to something we could not hear. Within 10 minutes, both boys arrived, Prentice with wide eyes, Thorne with the nervous guilt of a child thrust into adult matters. Holmes stood between them. Tell me, Samuel, did George say anything to you before supper? Thorne shook his head. He was gone too long. I came looking, that's all. And Daniel, have you spoken to George lately? Daniel looked from us to the boy on the floor, then back again. No, he's not in my class. Holmes studied him a moment, then placed the drawing into Daniel's hands. Look closely. Does this mean anything to you? Daniel frowned. It's familiar, because you've seen it. He nodded. In the book, the one James had. I saw it once when he was sketching. He said it wasn't from the book, but it came because of it, that it was something the pond wanted him to draw. Holmes took the paper back. Did he say what it meant? No, only that it wasn't finished. Holmes turned to me. Watson, do you recall what Flack said? Symmetry is the key. One on each side. This is what he meant. The first mirror was only part of the mechanism. The drawings were more than art, they were placement. And now George has completed the second arc. You mean he's replicating the structure? Holmes nodded. Yes, but unwittingly. Someone or something is still guiding the hand. He turned back to Addison. Have the groundskeeper comb every inch of the ruin. Look for signs of fire, ink, tools, anything left behind in the last 48 hours. Addison blinked. Do you suspect someone has returned there? I suspect, Holmes said coldly. They never left. We returned to our quarters after securing Maitland's room under lock. Holmes refused supper, pacing the floor as if retracing the loops in the drawing. I sat beside the fire, uneasy, watching the rain trace downward across the window panes like liquid script. At length, Holmes spoke. We've been searching for an individual, a mind behind these events. But what if we're wrong? I looked up. Wrong. What if it's not who but what? He placed the drawing between us again. It is imitating cognition, using the boys, one to open, one to extend. If it finds a third, he did not finish. I did not ask him to, for outside, far across the misted grounds, the surface of the pond rippled without wind, and somewhere beyond glass, beyond thoughts, something watched with a patience no man could comprehend. Chapter 10. The Third Symmetry. By morning, the rain had lessened, but the clouds remained alow, sullen ceiling pressing upon Ravensby like a closing hand. Holmes had slept scarcely an hour, and when I arose, I found him seated by the fireplace, the black map book on his knee, George Maitland's diagram pinned to the mantel. He looked up briefly. The pattern is accelerating, Watson. The ink is drying faster. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes. You believe another drawing will appear? Holmes stood and began pacing. Yes, the first symbol emerged with Wyndham, the second through Maitland. But the interval between them has shortened, weeks reduced to days. Now we must ask, Who is the next? I thought a moment. Daniel. Holmes's lips tightened. Possibly, but not necessarily. If the influence is no longer confined to those who touch the book, but to those who have seen it, then anyone could be next, including Thorne. A knock interrupted us. It was Addison again, his face drawn tight. "We've found something in the ruins," he said grimly. "You should see it." We followed him across the sodden courtyard, our boots sinking into soft earth. The air felt still, unnaturally so, as though the grounds themselves had been emptied of birdsong and breath. The trees near the chapel ruins stood slick and skeletal. Benlow met us at the entrance to the crumbling arch. He looked visibly shaken. "It weren't here yesterday," he muttered, leading us inside. There, at the center of the stone floor, beneath the gap where the roof had once been, lay a perfect triangle formed of white ash. At each point, a mirror shard had been driven into the floor with unnatural precision. They gleamed despite the gray sky. Holmes knelt immediately. "Don't step within the boundary," he warned. I peered over his shoulder. The ash lines were unbroken, forming the most exact isosceles triangle I had ever seen. No natural hand could have shaped it so finely on crumbling stone. Holmes held up a hand. "There, see this." He pointed to a faint trail of black running outward from the topmost shard-like ink. It led to a nearby column where someone had placed a piece of parchment, pinned by a nail driven into the stone. Holmes removed it carefully. Another drawing. This one showed a seated figure facing Oedipus back, hunched, head bowed. It sat within a triangle, as though confined. Above it hovered a mirror, but within the glass was not the figure's reflection, but another headless, looming thing beneath the image. "The third is the anchor." Holmes rose slowly. 3 points, 3 mirrors, 3 minds. We are watching something prepare itself. Prepare for what? He turned to me. Incarnation. The word sat in the air like a blasphemy. We returned to the school with the drawing secured in Holmes's satchel. Holmes ordered Addison to close the entire east wing and relocate the boys to the main hall. "Separate them," he said. "No groups of 3. No time near reflective surfaces. Not even water." Addison looked skeptical, but by now he knew better than to argue. That evening, Holmes conducted interviews with both Samuel Thorne and Daniel Prentice. I watched from the window of the study as the last light faded from the sky, casting the pond into shadow once more. "Thorne is frightened," Holmes said after, "but not touched. He doesn't carry the influence. And Daniel?" Holmes was silent a long time. "He dreams of it now." He described it without prompting. The triangle, the arches. He even saw the ink appear before it dried. My mouth went dry. "He's the third." Holmes nodded grimly. "Yes, then what do we do?" "We isolate him. We sever the lines. The triangle is only complete if the 3 minds remain connected." We brought Daniel into our quarters just after supper. He was pale and confused, but compliant. He asked no questions. Holmes gave him tea and asked only that he remain indoors through the night. Daniel accepted this with the blank obedience of a boy walking through fog. Then, with the boy quietly reading by the fire, Holmes sat beside me and opened the book again. "There's something we missed." He flipped through pages until he found one with a large circular shape overlaid with patterns of branching lines. "This," he said, "is not just an image, it's a cipher." He passed me a separate sheet with symbols arranged in mirrored patterns. "Compare the angles here and here." I didn't saw at once that they weren't decorative at all. They were timestamps, alignments, coordinates. I asked. "Moments," Holmes said, "not places, times." The next was less than 6 hours away. I looked at him. "You think it will try to complete the triangle tonight?" Holmes nodded once. "If it's following the pattern, yes. It will attempt to take Daniel, and if it does, then it will no longer need mirrors, Watson." That night we bolted the windows, covered the looking-glass, and extinguished all standing water. Daniel slept fitfully on a cot near the fire, his face twitching in dreams, and Holmes sat up in the chair by the door, revolver in his lap, a lantern burning low beside him, waiting, watching for the thing that now walked between reflections. Chapter 11. What watches between the candle had burned to a stub by the time I stirred. A chill, sourceless and bone-deep, had crept into the room. I sat upright, instinct prickling at my nape, and saw Holmes, still seated in the chair by the door, motionless, eyes sharp. His revolver remained on his lap, untouched. But the room had changed. Daniel's cot, near the hearth, was empty. My breath caught. "Holmes," he raised one finger. "Listen," he whispered. We did, for a long moment. There was only the hiss of the dying fire, and the distant creak of beams settling in old wood. Then, from somewhere deep within the eastern corridor sound, slow, deliberate footsteps just outside the threshold of our rooms. I rose, heart pounding, and Holmes moved to intercept me, motioning for silence. He slipped out into the hall, revolver drawn, and I followed close behind. The air out there was colder still. The oil lamp on the wall sputtered faintly, casting shadows that shifted as though stirred by unseen breath. We crept down the corridor toward the chapel side of the school, where the walls grew damper and the scent of mold tinged the air. Then, halfway down the hall, we saw him, Daniel. He stood barefoot in the center of the stone floor, facing the long mirror mounted on the end wall, the only one we had missed in our sweep. His eyes were wide open, unblinking. In his right hand was a piece of chalk. Below him, a shape was nearly complete, the same triple-pointed diagram that had appeared in the ruins. The mirror caught its reflection and doubled it. Holmes stepped forward quickly. "Daniel, stop." But the boy did not turn. His chalk moved once more, a final line. The triangle was whole, and then the mirror changed. Its surface darkened not with shadow, but with depth. The reflection of Daniel faded. Ours vanished. The torchlight dimmed to a weak halo. Within the mirror now pulsed something else, something wrong. A second triangle, an eye, a door. Daniel swayed on his feet. His lips moved, whispering something too low to hear. Then the mirror reached it, did not shatter. It unfolded its surface, distorting, peeling outward like silk submerged in water. A black ripple formed, expanding into the corridor. Holmes didn't hesitate. He stepped into the chalk triangle, grasped Daniel by the shoulders, and yanked him back with sudden force. The boy gasped, stumbling as if waking from a long fever dream. The ripple stilled. Then it contracted. The mirror snapped back into place with a sharp crack and fractured from corner to corner. Daniel collapsed in my arms, sobbing. Holmes bent beside us, breath shallow. It tried to use him, he said. The third. It needed his will, his awareness to finalize the symmetry. I helped Daniel to his feet. His skin was cold as ice. What did you see? I asked. He shook his head weakly. Nothing. But it saw me. It had my name. I didn't say it, but it had it. Holmes stood, gaze locked on the broken mirror. The act of drawing was the offering, he said. The final mark. Once he finished the symbol, it created a tether. The creature used the mirror as a passage, tempting to occupy him, a vessel. I looked at the mirror, now cracked and fading. Is it still there? Holmes did not answer at once. Then, softly, it never left. It merely failed. We guided Daniel back to our quarters, wrapped him in wool, and gave him tea laced with laudanum to still his trembling. He fell asleep quickly, the deep sleep of exhaustion, not trance. Holmes watched him for a long time before speaking again. We have confirmation now, he said. It is not the book. Not entirely. It is not even the ruin. It is the system, I said quietly. The process. Holmes nodded. The triangle. The invitation. The drawing. It follows a logicalian, but precise. It plants thought, spreads reflection, then waits to be seen. I sat beside him. What do we do now? Holmes opened his notebook and drew a swift circle, enclosing the triangle. He shaded it, line after line. We seal it, he said. Seal what? The intention, before it draws another, before it learns how to open without permission. Outside, the sky remained dark, though dawn was only an hour off, and somewhere below, in the broken depths of that now shattered glass, I thought I heard something move, not in anger, in patience. Chapter 12. The circle must not break by first light. The cracked mirror had been removed. Holmes supervised its burial, personally insisting that it be taken to the far field beyond the school's orchard, shattered into fragments, and then buried in separate pits beneath salted earth. It was, he said, a psychological act as much as a physical one. Mirrors invite recurrence, he muttered, but this one must not return. Daniel Prentice remained asleep in our quarters, watched over by Nurse Kemp and a constable who had come at Holmes's request from the nearby village. Maitland, too, had shown signs of recovery, but he was pale, quiet, and could not speak more than a few clipped words before drifting back into silence. It was as if some part of him still faced the mirror, refusing to turn. Holmes, meanwhile, returned to the ruins before midday, accompanied by Benlow and myself. The triangle had been tampered with, the ash lines blurred by wind and rain, but the shards remained, though less luminous now, dulled like the mirror that had tried to take Daniel. Holmes stared at them for some time. I had thought the symbols were passive, he said at last. A language waiting to be spoken. But this was a script that wrote back. He knelt and placed a fresh sheet of paper where the triangle had been. Watson, you recall what Flack said, that the system required symmetry. That thought itself, once patterned, becomes an invitation. You believe the drawings are living. I believe, Holmes said, that the entity, whatever its nature, is incapable of reaching unless invited. And invitations, in this case, are constructed through repetition, through ritual, through the mind. He took out Wyndham's final sketch and laid it beside the parchment. There's one element common to all of them, he continued, the downward spiral, the descent. Even when masked beneath other symbols, it appears like a watermark beneath ink. I examined the sketches more closely. The spiral homes indicated coiled inward, in each one some as mirrored arcs, others hidden in folds of drawn cloth or shadowed doorways. Each time it suggested a fall. Not literal, but a collapse of boundary. Holmes tapped the center of the spiral with the tip of his pencil. This is the door, Watson. But doors are not built in isolation. He turned toward the old altar stone at the back of the ruin, now moss-covered and fractured. We need to find the first line, the original invitation. With Benlow's help, we cleared the overgrowth from around the stone. Beneath the moss, barely legible, was a covenant, worn by time but unmistakably the same circle-triangle motif seen in the boy's drawings. Holmes exhaled slowly. Here it is, the root, not their invention, inheritance. From whom? I asked. Holmes did not reply. Instead, he rose, took the fresh parchment, and using charcoal, traced the carving's faint outline. We seal the pattern, he said. We give it closure. Back at the school, he assembled the headmaster and faculty in the great hall. The boys had been gathered there as well, grouped by class under the close eye of the staff. Holmes stood before them, strangely commanding despite the weariness in his face. There are moments, he began, when the mind becomes a door. It does not mean to, but through repetition, fascination, and design, it opens. And once open, it does not always close on its own. He turned, lifting the traced parchment. This symbol, he said, is the lock, but only when made whole. The triangle alone was unstable 3 points seeking a center. But the circle contains, it concludes, it ends. He handed the parchment to Addison. Place this over the ruin's altar. Instruct no one to draw these symbols again. No copies, no sketches, no mirrors in the chapel's line of sight. The circle must not break. Addison accepted the charge with quiet gravity. Holmes nodded. One last matter. The book, he meant the black volume, the one that had first surfaced in Wyndham's possession. It was laid out on the desk beside us. Pages curled slightly at the edges, the ink within now strangely faded, as if the thing had burned through its own intentions and gone hollow. Holmes took the book, turned to the final page, blank-hand placed the mirror shard retrieved from the ruins. Atop it, the flames were high and blue at the center, as though consuming more than parchment. Addison stepped back, shielding his face. Even I flinched as the final corner curled into ashdot when it was done. Holmes stirred the cinders with a steel rod. Let it lie. This case, he said, is no longer criminal. It is psychological, spatial, symbolic. Let no boy return to those ruins for any purpose. And if you must rebuild, rebuild with unbroken lines. That night, as we packed for our return to London, Holmes was quiet. You do not believe it gone, I said. He closed his bag carefully. No, but I believe we denied it this place. For now, do you believe it will return? He looked at me with something almost like wariness. It's not a matter of belief, Watson. It's a matter of reflection. And with that, he turned out the light. But I dreamed of spirals and glass that did not reflect, and of something behind it. Waiting still. Chapter 13. The Echo in the Glass. We returned to London 2 days later, weary and unspeaking for much of the journey. Holmes, though quiet, was not idle. He stared out of the train window, his brow furrowed, not with mystery, but with calculation. I knew that expression well. It was the look of a man adding something up and finding that one figure would not resolve as the wheels of the train clattered toward Baker Street. I ventured. You believe the entity is still active? Holmes's eyes did not leave the passing countryside. Dormant, perhaps, but dormant is not dead. We said little more until we reached 221B. Mrs. Hudson welcomed us back with relief and her usual flurry of tea, scones, and tactful silence. By the time we were seated before our own hearth, the comforts of the familiar seemed to begin dulling the more troubling images that lingered in our minds. Triangles of ash, unreflecting glass, boys with hollow stares. Holmes placed a slim envelope on the mantel and sat back. I have sent a letter to Mycroft, not to involve the government, of course, but to ensure any records relating to Ravensby's founding and chapel are sealed. I suspect such histories, if left open, may be read again. And you trust the sealing of records to be enough? I asked. Holmes took up his violin and tuned the E string absently. For now, our job is not to chase phantoms across the world, Watson, only to bar the door they came through. But 3 nights later, the door creaked again. It began with a letter, not delivered by post, but slid through the front door sometime after dusk. Mrs. Hudson swore no one had knocked. There was no wax seal, no return address, just a folded sheet inside. Holmes opened it with one hand and read aloud. To the watcher by the pond, you thought it sealed. But shadows live in pattern, not place. We do not need the ruin. We need the mind that drew the shape. And you have not broken him. You brought him home. I rose from my chair. They mean Daniel. Holmes nodded. The pattern isn't tied to the ruin. It's tied to continuity. It followed him. He turned the paper over. On the back was a sketch lightly drawn in graphite, a spiral. But this time, the spiral wasn't descending. It was expanding. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The pattern has inverted. It's no longer seeking entry, it's seeking projection. We went to Daniel at once. The boy had been placed under the care of Holmes's acquaintance, Miss Claiborne, a stern and exceptionally rational governess with experience managing vulnerable children. Her lodgings on Berwick Street were modest but immaculate, and Daniel had a room there with no mirrors and only the most mundane of books. When we arrived, Miss Claiborne greeted us with a worried glance. He's been quiet, met, but last night he was up late, drawing. I thought it best not to intervene. We found him seated by the window, sketchbook in his lap, a pencil dangling loosely in one hand. He looked up at Holmes, then me, and smiled faintly. They're further now, he said. I don't see them as clearly. Holmes sat beside him. Daniel, what were you drawing? The boy held up the page. It was a circle, perfectly round. Inside it, a triangle. But the triangle was broken at each corner, its points extending outward like roots or antennae. It resembled, in a strange way, the diagrams of electrical fields I had seen in one of Holmes's physics volumes. It's the opposite, Daniel said. Before, it pulled things in. Now it pushes. It's trying to leave. Holmes placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. And why do you see it? I don't know. It's like it left part of itself inside. A line. I follow it when I sleep. He turned toward the window. And sometimes, I think it follows me back. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Outside, the wind stirred through the alley. A gas lamp flickered near the far curb. "What do we do?" I asked Holmes quietly as we stepped into the sitting room. He pressed his fingers together. "We've been thinking about the triangle as a destination, but it was never that. It was a device. The mirrors were only symbols, reflective tools. What matters is the pattern, and now it's rewriting the shape." I stared at him. "Then destroying the mirror, burning the book, that wasn't enough." Holmes shook his head. "Those were expressions, not origins. The true medium is the mind. And as long as Daniel continues to perceive, the line remains drawn." There was a long silence. Then Holmes said, "We must break the pattern inside him." "How?" Holmes looked out the window into the shifting London night. "I don't know. Not yet. But the next move won't come through mirrors, Watson." He turned back to me, his voice low and steady. "It will come through dreams." And at that moment, Daniel back in the bedroom let out a soft murmur in his sleep. The pencil had dropped to the floor, and in the last light of day, on the open sketchbook page, a spiral still turned, not inward, not outward, but side to side, as if it were watching, waiting, drawing something of its own. Chapter 14. The Dream That Didn't Belong. Following morning broke with a pale gray drizzle that seemed to sap the color from everything it touched. Holmes stood at the mantelpiece in our Baker Street sitting room, his breakfast untouched, his gaze fixed on Daniel Prentice's most recent sketch. The spiral had grown overnight, an extra ring added to the drawing, each line perfectly spaced despite the child's slumber. "It is evolving without his conscious will," Holmes muttered. "That is the part I find most disturbing." I nodded, seated across from him. "It's as though something else is using his hand, or his memory," Holmes replied. "This is no longer possession, Watson. It's continuation, a residual intelligence patterned within the mind self, like an infection that writes instead of burns." A knock at the door interrupted our grim thoughts. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a telegram. "Just delivered, Mr. Holmes. From Miss Claiborne, I believe." Holmes tore it open swiftly and scanned the brief message. His face grew grim. "Daniel has not spoken since dawn. Woke, sweating. Said he had a dream, but that it wasn't his. Has drawn again. Pages torn from book. Afraid. Come at once. Within 20 minutes." We were in a cab, speeding back to Berwick Street, when Miss Claiborne received us at the door. Her face was drawn and pale. "He's been mute most of the morning," she said. "He handed me these without a word." She passed Holmes several torn pages from Daniel's sketchbook, their edges ragged, the pencil lines faint but furious. Holmes examined them with care. I leaned in. Each drawing seemed a fragment of a larger image, sections of some kind of architecture, but not of any earthly variety. Angles bent inwards upon themselves, windows opened into darkness rather than space, and at the center of one fragment stood a door with no hinges, its threshold inked black. But beneath it, in shaking pencil, it opened for someone else. Holmes's hand tensed. "I thought we'd closed it," I murmured. "We closed his gate," Holmes said. "But someone else was watching." He turned to Miss Claiborne. "Has anyone else spoken to him?" "A visitor." She shook her head. "Only the boy, George Maitland. He came yesterday, just briefly. Said he wanted to bring Daniel a book." Holmes turned sharply. "What book?" She hesitated. I didn't see. Daniel didn't seem disturbed at the time. Holmes's voice dropped. Where is Maitland now? At home with his parents. In Chelsea, I believe. His father withdrew him from the school following your report. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. Then we must speak with the Maitlands immediately. Chelsea, though more genteel than Berwick Street, seemed to lie under the same graying pall. Mr. and Mrs. Maitland received us stiffly anxious but polite. George has hardly said a word since he left Ravensby, his mother told us. He's been sketching, which we encouraged. Quiet pastimes, you understand. We were told he needed rest. Holmes wasted no time. May we see him? They led us to the upstairs parlor, where George sat cross-legged on the floor, a notebook in his lap, a stub of charcoal in one hand. He did not look up when we entered. George Holmes said gently, kneeling before him, "Do you remember me?" The boy nodded slightly, eyes never leaving the page. "What are you drawing?" George didn't speak, but held out the notebook. It was the same door Daniel had drawn, but now opened fully. Beyond its threshold was not darkness, but a sliver of mirror, cracked. Reaching Holmes took the notebook and examined the lines. Then he turned back to George. "Where did you see this?" The boy finally looked up. His voice was so quiet, I barely caught it. "In Daniel's dream." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You shared a dream." George nodded. "I didn't mean to, but it was there, waiting. It said it wanted to show me something Daniel wouldn't look at. I felt my stomach turn." "You believe it's passing from one mind to another?" "No," Holmes said softly. "I believe it always intended more than one. Wyndham, Maitland, Daniel, each a part of the structure. Each a point on a larger pattern." He looked back at the notebook. "And now it's finished drawing them." I frowned. "What does it want now?" Holmes closed the notebook slowly. "An observer, Watson." I stared at him. "Us," he nodded. "The drawings are invitations. But we've not merely intercepted them. We've read them, spoken their language, and now, like any authorate, wishes to be seen." As we left the Maitland home, Holmes said nothing for several streets. Then, finally, "Tonight, we break the tether." "You mean with Daniel?" "With both boys. Their minds have become mirrors. But mirrors, Watson, can be shattered." I did not sleep that night, for I had seen the sketches. Not just seen them, but understood them, if only briefly. And I could not help but wonder, as I stared into my shaving glass before bed, was I now a mirror, too? Chapter 15. The Mind Without Corners. Slice, 9 o'clock that evening. Holmes summoned me to his study, where the gaslights had been lowered and the windows drawn shut with heavy velvet. On the desk he had laid out 3 objects: Daniel's final spiral sketch, George Maitland's mirror door drawing, and the parchment rubbing of the chapel's original triangle circle. The room felt colder than it should. Holmes stood behind the desk, with hands clasped behind his back, his face pale but resolute. "It is time, Watson," he said. I folded my arms. "Time for what?" He gestured to the diagrams. "To sever the tether, to break the recursive pattern that has spread from Ravensby to Daniel. From Daniel to George, and now threatens to infect anyone who witnesses the shape." "And how exactly do you propose to break a pattern within the mind?" He gave a thin smile. "By creating a contradiction." Holmes stepped to the hearth and pulled down a box I had not seen in years. Inside it were sealed glass slides and a lantern projector of his own design. He handed me one of the slides. I held it to the light. It showed a perfectly symmetrical triangle, but every edge was subtly curved. A visual paradox, Holmes said. A contradiction in geometric logic. To the conscious mind, it seems almost normal. But to the unconscious, the part that receives these mirror-invited impressions, disruption. You intend to show this to the boys? Yes, in sequence. Alongside the patterns they have been drawing. A sort of neural short circuit. He opened his notebook and showed me a diagram of the spiral. Daniel had drawn now, marked with red slashes at irregular intervals. If the spiral is the path, Watson, then irregularity is the wall. That night, Daniel and George were brought under our roof once more. Miss Claiborne, having been briefed on Holmes's intentions, remained to help monitor them. The boys said, little each, in a peculiar, detached calm. As if exhaustion had dulled their sense of the strange, Holmes arranged 2 chairs opposite the wall, where he had rigged a cloth sheet as his projection surface. He dimmed the lamps and lit the lantern. Daniel, he said, George, I'm going to show you a series of drawings. I want you to look at them and tell me when you feel something. Anything at all, even if you cannot explain it. They nodded. The first image was George's mirror door. No reaction. Then came Daniel's expanded spiral. George frowned. I remember this. Holmes turned the slide. The projected image shifted to the warped triangle. A beat passed. Then Daniel flinched. Holmes narrowed his eyes. What did you see? I don't know, the boy said, his voice trembling. It doesn't make sense. Holmes flipped again. A circle without a center. George turned his head. It's wrong. It won't reflect. Holmes turned to me. Now, Watson, begin. I stepped forward and handed each boy a blank page and a pencil. Draw whatever you feel now, I said softly. Not what you've seen before. What you feel now. They obeyed. Slowly, carefully, lines began to form. Daniel's pencil faltered. Not a spiral this time, but a half-loop, broken at its arc. George drew what looked like a door butt placed sideways, as though it could never open. Holmes watched carefully. The pattern is changing, he murmured. Disruption achieved. But then a knock at the door, not the front door. The study door. We turned. Miss Claiborne stepped forward. I locked the house, she said. No one could have entered. Holmes raised a hand for silence. The knock came again. Soft, rhythmic, 3 taps, 3 more, and then 3 more. 9 in total. The boys looked up in unison and began drawing again, but this time they drew the same shape, a triangle, open at the top and at its center, a black oval, inked with such pressure the pencil tips cracked. Holmes moved at once. He swept the pages from their hands and threw them into the hearth. The flames took them. Instantly, Daniel screamed. The lights flared. The study door creaked open, not broken, not forced, just opened. But no one stood beyond it. Only darkness. Holmes stepped toward it. That pulled my full attention. You mean someone created the pattern deliberately? Indeed, Holmes replied, rising to stand before the fireplace. What we encountered at Ravensby was no accident of haunting, no elemental spirit caught in glass. It was a mechanism, a sequence, designed with purpose, a logic so old it now appears mystical. He pulled a folder from the mantel and handed it to me. Inside were notes, transcripts from our visits, drawings copied from Daniel and George's sketchbooks, the parchment rubbing from the chapel altar. The earliest recorded mention of the Ravensby Chapel dates to the mid-1600s, Holmes continued. But its foundations are far older, Roman, perhaps pre-Roman. Its dedication was always peculiar, anonymous, unblessed by any saint, and its iconography, even in ruin, resembles nothing from Christian canon. I frowned. But why a school? Holmes smiled faintly. Because schools gather minds, and minds, especially the young, the imaginative, are raw material for such a construct. Patterns do not require belief, Watson, only attention. He paced slowly. Imagine a shape that cannot survive in the physical world unless seen, a thought entity, a form made not of matter but of recognition, one that propagates through dreams, through symbols, through the reflections of human curiosity. What we encountered was not trying to escape the mirror, it was trying to become memory. Then Daniel and George were vessels, chosen not for who they were, but for how they perceived. Each boy completed a stage of the pattern, just as a musician might strike the right note without knowing the melody. But once the tune is finished, Watson, what happens? The door opens, I said softly. Holmes nodded, and we closed it, not with fire or force, but by introducing error. We gave it something it could not digest: paradox, disorder. We taught its intended audience to draw wrong. I let that settle, then asked, and the book? Was it part of it? Holmes took his seat again. An artifact, perhaps planted long ago, perhaps drawn into being by the pattern itself. I am no metaphysician, Watson, but I suspect the pattern can generate its own artifacts, like a fever manifesting a hallucination. We sat in silence for a time. Then I asked, and you, Holmes, you saw it too? The shimmer in the glass, the presence at the door. Has it truly gone? He gave a long pause before answering. Double quotes. No. But it no longer has purchase. The boys are safe. The ruin is sealed. And the shard, the last true fragment of symmetrical reflection, is beneath a mile of salt water. Thought may travel, Watson, but even thought has limits when it is forgotten. I considered that carefully, but what of those who remember? Holmes looked directly at me. We write it down, not to spread it, but to contain it. Language is a circle, Watson, a safe one. When framed correctly, it becomes not a mirror, but a window. And so, we document not with illustration, but with deduction, not with geometry, but with logic. I nodded, and so I wrote. That very evening I began my account, careful in phrasing, exact in detail, removing anything that might spark replication. The drawings were locked away, the sketches destroyed. The Ravensby incident, as I came to call it, was archived not in Holmes's usual annals of triumph, but in a separate ledger. He kept 4 cases unresolved in spirit. We never spoke of it again in detail, but sometimes, on rare nights, I'd catch Holmes glancing into a window, not to look through it, but to ensure it still reflected only him, and once, just once, I saw him reach out to touch the surface of his violin, not with the grace of a musician, but the wariness of a man who knew the shape of doors. As for me, I avoided mirrors for a time, not out of fear, but out of respect, because, in the end, the most dangerous reflections are not the ones that look back, but the ones that wait for you to forget what they once showed. The end. I grabbed his arm. Holmes, no. But he looked not at the threshold, but at the wall beside it, and I saw it then, to dot a shadow cast by the boys, nor by the fire, a tall, angular shape with no depth, but too many angles. It shimmered like heat in glass, and in its center no face, but a smear of reflective shimmer. Holmes turned to the boys. Look away, now. They obeyed. I did too. A wind impossible. Indoor wind blew out the lantern. The shape pressed forward once more, then stopped. Holmes, with both hands, held out a final slide, a shape that defied logic entirely, triangle with 4 points, a paradox in form. He raised it like a mirror. The shimmer recoiled, and with it, the room snapped soundlessly back into stillness. The door stood open, but the thing that had knocked was gone. Holmes lowered the slide and exhaled slowly. We forced it to see something it could not comprehend. I stared at him. You think that's enough? He looked at the boys now, unconscious, but breathing steadily. It is, for tonight. And outside, beyond the gaslit street, every pane of every window reflected a world, just slightly askew. Chapter 16. The Mirror's End. The morning after the knocking. The air in 221B Baker Street felt thinner, as if something had finally exhaled after a long and terrible hold. Holmes stood by the study door, now firmly closed and bolted, inspecting the frame for any mark, any remnant. But there was nothing, no sign of entry or exit, no footprint, no indentation on the floorboards, only silence. Do you believe it's gone? I asked, not bothering to mask the fatigue in my voice. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he traced a line in the dust near the threshold with his cane. What is absence, Watson? He said softly. Is it the lack of a thing? Or the thing itself in a form we cannot measure? I sighed and moved to the window. Outside, London was indifferent as ever, carts clattering by, smoke curling from chimneys, the cries of newsboys calling out half-sensical headlines. We had saved the boys, but something still felt incomplete. Miss Laybourne arrived just before noon, accompanied by 2 physicians arranged by Mycroft at Holmes's request. They would take Daniel and George into extended care at a quiet, undisclosed estate in Sussex, far from any chapel, any mirror, any pond. They will be safe, Holmes said, as the boys were led to the carriage. Keep them isolated. Limit light exposure at night. No glass, no reflective surfaces. Most of all, no symmetry. Miss Claiborne's eyes narrowed. You think it could still find them? Holmes's expression was unreadable. I think the shape may still be looking for itself. After their departure, Holmes turned to me. One final thread remains. I understood at once the mirror we had buried. We left for Ravensby that evening, traveling by private carriage under cover of dusk. Addison met us outside the school, visibly aged by recent weeks. The boys speak of it only in sleep now, he told us, but not often. The chapel remains sealed. Holmes wasted no time. We passed by the school proper and made for the field near the orchard, where Benlow had originally interred the mirror shards. Rain had softened the earth, and the burial plots, separate and salted, were now covered in sodden leaves. Holmes stepped into the center and looked down. Watson, he said softly, help me dig. We worked in silence for nearly an hour, uncovering one fragment at a time. The first 2 were dull and lifeless. The third, however, gleamed faintly beneath the soil despite the lack of light. Holmes held it up with a gloved hand. The shard vibrated faintly in the windless air. He said nothing, only stared. Then, with a movement sudden and precise, he placed it into a lead-lined box he had brought in his satchel. "We take this to the sea." I blinked. "The sea," he nodded. "To the deepest tide, Watson. And then we sink it." We made for Dover by nightfall, arriving at the cliffs as the tide pulled away from shore. Holmes had arranged a small skiff through one of his coastal contacts, a man who asked no questions, merely lit a lantern and waited. We rowed silently out beneath a starless sky. Holmes sat with the box across his knees, his eyes fixed not on the horizon, but on the reflectionless water that surrounded us, black and smooth like the pond. "Why the ocean?" I asked. "Because," Holmes said, "the ocean has no single reflection. It is too vast, too fractured. It does not mirror. It swallows." He opened the box. The shard glimmered dimly, its edges quivering ever so slightly as though resisting or reaching. Then Holmes drew from his coat a small folded sheet of Daniel's final disrupted sketch, the antipathy, the contradiction. He wrapped the shard in it tightly, and without a word, dropped it into the waves. We watched it vanish into the deep. No sound, no ripple, only stillness. Holmes sat back and closed the box, and then, after a long breath, "It won't be the last, Watson." I turned. "You think others exist?" "I know they do," he said quietly. "Patterns this old do not emerge by chance. There are other schools, other ponds, other minds hungry to make sense of senseless things." He paused. "But for now, we have bought peace." As we returned to shore, a thin line of dawn began to break over the sea, a smear of gold. Across the charcoal horizon, the first true light in weeks. Holmes watched it in silence, and I, beside him, did not look down, not into the water, not into the sky's reflection, but only forward, into a world where symmetry had once whispered and been, for a moment, silenced. Chapter 17. A reflection that did not return. Several weeks had passed since we consigned the final mirror shard to the sea. The world, as it always does after an encounter with the strange, had attempted to return to its familiar rhythms. The fog of London drifted again over the Thames. The hansom cabs resumed their quarrels with pedestrians, and the clink of glasses in dim public houses once more overtook whispered stories of boys and drawings and dreams that were not their own. At 1221B Baker Street, however, the quiet held a different weight. Holmes had returned to his usual pursuits, experiments with belladonna, the study of bee behavior, a brief correspondence on unsolved ciphers, but I noticed a subtle shift in him. His gaze lingered longer upon reflections. His hands, once fidgeting and restless, moved more deliberately, as if wary of drawing lines that might complete shapes best left undone. One morning, as a low spring sun illuminated the patterned carpet of our sitting room, Holmes set aside the morning paper and spoke. "I have considered the matter deeply, Watson," he said, "and I believe the final piece of the puzzle has now placed itself." "Do you refer to the mirror?" I asked, glancing up from my writing. "No," he said. "Not the object. The architect.